Hello, my name is David Mendel. Today I'm standing in front of the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, the oldest Anglican cathedral built outside the British Isles. When the British conquered Quebec in 1759, there was a terrible siege, many of the buildings were badly damaged, and everything had to be rebuilt. There was a very small English population and pretty well no English craftsmen. So French craftsmen rebuilt the city that it had been before the conquest. So for the first decades after the conquest, there was little to symbolize the British presence in Quebec City. It wasn't until after the American Revolution that Quebec became the capital of British North America, and the British began to build official buildings. They enlarged and rebuilt the governor's residence. They built a prison, a courthouse, and this cathedral. The cathedral was designed by two British artillery officers. They were very proud of what they had done, and Major Robe, one of the officers, wrote a detailed text describing how they had designed this church. In his text, he tells us that they took their basic inspiration from the famous church, St. Martin in the Fields, on Trafalgar Square. The floor plan is almost identical, just a tiny bit smaller, but they had to simplify the facade. For those of you who have been to London and seen St. Martin in the Fields, the facade there has an impressive portico with large Corinthian columns. Here in Quebec, with the state of the quarries at the time, it was not possible to extract stones large enough to do this, and so they compromised and placed these flat columns called pilasters on the facade. Notice also the shape of the pediment, that triangular form beneath the roofline. If you think back to the temples of ancient Greece and Rome, or perhaps neoclassical banks here in North America, you might realize that it doesn't follow the strict rules of classical architecture. The slopes are much higher and steeper than they would normally be. The interesting thing is that when this church was first constructed, the pediment did have the right shape, but they had so much trouble with snow accumulation and water infiltration that it was decided to follow the local French tradition and build a higher, steeper roof to replace the old one, and they raised the front and back walls to meet that new roof. Inside the church, if we go up into the attic, we can still see the original pediment, or we can even look down on the structure which holds up the roof of the interior of the church. And now let's go inside and discover the interior of this magnificent church. Can you imagine military officers today designing a church like this? In the late 18th century, British officers received a very different type of education. They were trained at the military academy at Woolwich, and amongst other things, they were taught topographical drawing. Before the invention of photography, it was important for officers to be able to record landscapes for strategic reasons. The academy even hired one of the best watercolorists of the late 18th century, Paul Sandby, to teach them. Most of these young men were from an aristocratic background, and they had a lot of free time to pursue their interests when they were not at war. Some of them became very talented amateur artists, and some of the finest views that we have of former parts of the British Empire, whether it be in India or Barbados or Quebec, were made by these military officers. Some of them also became amateur architects. Sometimes in colonial architecture, there is a certain awkwardness, but there's no such awkwardness here. These two officers had a very sophisticated understanding of the principles of classical architecture, to the extent that you could put a perfect sphere in the sanctuary of this church. When you come in here, the proportions feel right because they are just right. They did not just copy the interior of St. Martin in the Fields. They tell us in the text that they wrote about the church that they took inspiration from various Italian Renaissance architects. So, for example, Palladio inspired the Ionic columns beside me here. Behind us, under the organ, the principles of Alberti. And around this magnificent stained glass window over the main altar, the principles of Vignola. Above me is the coat of arms of King George III, which marks the royal pew. The pew reserved for members of the royal family if they were to come to worship here, a rare occasion. But in 1860, for example, the Prince of Wales worshipped up there. More often, it would have been the place where the representative of the crown would sit, the governor, for example. However, in 1987, when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came here, they had no intention of sitting above the people. They chose to sit in 2 chairs in the center aisle. So our society is a bit less hierarchical today. But when this church was constructed, it was very hierarchical. And the pews just in front of me were reserved for the most important members of the congregation. The pews were rented, and the most expensive ones were closest to the sanctuary and the pulpit from which the sermon was given. If you were less wealthy, had less money to spend, you could be in a pew on the side or way in the back. If you were one of the coachmen who drove these important people to church, you would have sat on a little wooden bench without a back on the top balcony way up there. Also, in some old plans of the church, we see that there were benches that ran down the center aisle, and on the plan was written, "For the orphans." Rather sad, but in those days, everyone was expected to know their place. Since 1899, however, people can sit wherever they like, and the pews are no longer rented. Speaking of hierarchy, I'd like to show you the bishop's throne and the coat of arms of the diocese. Above the bishop's throne, or cathedra, is the coat of arms of the diocese. At the very top, we see the bishop's golden mitre, and below that a shield divided into 2 parts, blue above and red below. Dividing the two is a wavy line symbolizing the ocean which separates England from Quebec. On the red background is a golden British lion holding a key, symbolizing the confidence of the sovereign in the bishop. And in the upper corner, we see 4 crosses taken from the coat of arms of the Archbishop of Canterbury. A bishop's cross is placed across a book which symbolizes the gospel. The officers were most proud of their ceiling. If you see a similar church in London, the ceiling will be made of plaster or stucco. Here the officers were concerned that with the extreme changes in temperature, very hot in the summertime, very cold in the winter, that the plaster might break. And so instead they made the ceiling out of wood. And they took their inspiration from the houses that they saw in Quebec City with board and batten ceilings. By that I mean if you have 2 planks, you have a thin strip of wood which hides the joint between the 2. They took those thin strips of wood and crisscrossed them on the ceiling. And if we look at the ceiling over the sanctuary area, you can see how the diamond shapes become smaller and smaller with mathematical precision. Notice as well the name of God written in Hebrew above our heads here. People are often surprised by that, but if you go to St. Martin in the Fields in London, you'll see exactly the same thing over the sanctuary and on certain Catholic churches in the Quebec City region. This is not ecumenicism before its time. It's looking back to the Old Testament and the origins of Christian church. This is perhaps the best preserved church interior in Quebec City. The Ursuline Chapel has older ornamentation going back to the 1720s and 30s, but the chapel itself had to be reconstructed and the ornamentation integrated into it. Notre-Dame de Quebec, the Catholic Basilica and Cathedral, also has a spectacular interior, but it had to be completely reproduced after a fire destroyed the building in 1922. There were no such disasters in this church. It simply evolved over time. Certain things are certainly different from when it was first constructed, though. For example, originally there were no stained glass windows. There were clear windows so that you could see the city around us, somewhat like in a New England meeting house, for example. Also, the pulpit, instead of being on the side as we would normally expect it, was just in front of where I'm standing now. This showed the influence of the Reformation on the Anglican Church. The pulpit was much higher than the present pulpit with large staircases on either side. More emphasis was placed on the Word of God in the form of the sermon and the reading of Scripture than on the ceremony of Holy Communion. But in England in the 1830s, 1840s, there were major changes in the Anglican Church. Based in Cambridge and Oxford, a movement began to look back to the time before the Reformation, during the Middle Ages. Inspiration was taken from medieval churches, and they began to build neo-Gothic churches with deep chancels, placing a lot of emphasis on the altar and the ceremony of Holy Communion. You could only follow this movement fairly well in a church like this because the building itself is inspired by the temples of classical antiquity. So one thing that they could do was install memorial windows in the medieval tradition. some of them quite spectacular, in particular the window behind me now above the main altar. Many of these windows were made in London. The window behind me was made by a firm called Clutterbuck in the 1860s in memory of our third bishop. Other windows in the church were made in London or by British craftsmen who came here after being trained in the British tradition. There are also monuments made in London, which are some of them quite remarkable. Above the royal pew is a monument to the memory of the 4th Duke of Richmond. This is the same Duke of Richmond who, with his wife, gave the famous ball before the Battle of Waterloo. Lord Byron wrote a poem about it. Movies have been made showing this famous ball. After the war, the Duke of Richmond was sent to Quebec as Governor General of British North America. And very unfortunately for him, while he was here, he was bitten by a rabid fox, died of rabies, and he's buried underneath the sanctuary of this church. And his family made that monument to his memory. Other monuments, very interesting, which tell us a lot about the world of the British officers who were here and British soldiers in Quebec in the 19th century. For example, just behind the chamber organ, there is a monument in memory of 2 soldiers who died fighting a fire in Quebec City in the late 19th century. The battle honors of their regiment are carved in marble at the top of the monument, and we discover that they fought at Waterloo and at Lucknow in India. Another example, above one of the galleries, tells us about a British officer who was born in Quebec City. He was half English and half French-Canadian. He enrolled in the British Army in the early 19th century and became an officer, and we read in the description of his career that he fought in Afghanistan for the British Empire in the 1840s, which certainly has a resonance for us today, and he died leading his troops in a charge in India. I'm standing in an exhibition entitled The King's Gift, exceptional silver given by King George III to this church and made during the construction of the church. When we think of King George III, we think of the king who went mad, the king who lost the United States during the American Revolution. People often don't realize that he was one of the greatest patrons of the arts in the history of the royal family. He had a very long reign, reigning almost 60 years. Certainly during the last 10 years of his life, he was incapacitated by mental illness. But prior to that, he was a great patron of the arts and sciences. And it was thanks to his generosity, for example, that the Royal Academy was founded. Thanks to his generosity as well, that new headquarters were found for the Royal Society of Scientists. He supported individual scientists, famous people such as the astronomer Herschel, the creator of the Great English Dictionary, Dr. Johnson. He supported artists such as Thomas Gainsborough. So this great patron of the arts commissioned the royal goldsmiths Rundell and Bridge to make this remarkable service. Rundell and Bridge were going to go on to serve 4 successive British monarchs, and for example, they made the crown of Queen Victoria. The most spectacular work of all is no doubt this alms plate. It's hard to imagine taking up the collection but I have seen it done with a cushion placed on it. One could realize how these are actually used. This is a display piece, and for example, when Prince William and Kate Middleton were married, there were pieces like this on display in the altar in Westminster Abbey. It's worth looking at from very close up. In the center is the Last Supper. And in the corners, we have the coat of arms of the king, the coat of arms of the Diocese of Quebec, because this was made for the Diocese of Quebec, and the symbol of the Trinity. This is the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. And in the margins as well, we see the 4 evangelists. So, for example, St. Luke, the winged bull, and St. Mark, the winged lion. We also see in here these wonderful candlesticks, which are designed so that they can be taken out and used each Sunday. The rest of this is a very high security facility, and the other objects do not move. The king also sent fabric which was used during the coronation at Westminster Abbey, and the cathedral made an altar frontal with that. King George had the greatest private library in Europe, 65,000 volumes in Buckingham House, what is now known as Buckingham Palace. It was open to scholars. He also had within the house a royal bindery where bookbinders would bind his books in leather and then stamp them with gold. Today, the collection, which is called the King's Library, is in the British Library in London. And there is a building within a building made of glass, about 5 or 6 stories in height, displaying all of these magnificent volumes. And scholars can still borrow them today. The cathedral has superb acoustics, and it's an ideal place for classical music and sacred music. There are 2 organs in the cathedral. The main one above the main entrance in the gallery up there was made by the Warren firm from Montreal in the late 19th century and then expanded by Casavant in the early 20th century. The console up there in the gallery is no longer used by the organist because he now plays at a more modern console just beside the sanctuary near where I'm standing now, linked electronically with the organ. In the past, when the organist played up in that gallery, the choir sang up there as well. Today, the choir sings in front. The organist always noticed when he was playing that big organ just beside the choir that there was a slight delay between when he played and when the music came out. And he heard about this organ, which has quite a history. This organ is actually older than the cathedral itself, but we've only had it since 2004. This organ was made in London, England in 1790 by John England and Son. It was originally in a country house near Sheffield, and it was owned by an eminent physician named Bagshaw, who was also a great patron of the arts and a brilliant musician. He was a friend of the famous composer Franz Joseph Haydn, and it's possible that Haydn played this organ. The organ had to be sold along with other objects in the possession of the family who owned the house in the early 20th century. It was purchased later on by a Canadian collector who protected musical instruments, and eventually, after his death, ended up in the collection of the city of Montreal. Our organist heard about it and thought, wouldn't it be remarkable if we could have this very rare English chamber organ in this very appropriate English environment so far away from Great Britain? We were very fortunate when an anonymous donor provided the funds for the organ to be purchased and restored. And it was inaugurated in 2004 on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of this church with a period music concert with our organist playing and les violons du roi. We're now going to go to a rather spectacular location up into the bell tower to meet one of the bell ringers and see the oldest collection of English change-ringing bells in Canada. We've climbed high into the belfry and we're looking down on the oldest change-ringing bells in Canada, made in London in 1830. I'm with Douglas Kitson, who has been ringing the bells in this cathedral for over 20 years. Douglas, can you tell us a little bit about the firm that made these bells?
Yeah, they were made by the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, which they claim they were founded in the 1500s, but there is some documentation that says they were founded in the 1400s. So it was the oldest manufacturing company in England, but it only just very recently closed down.
Why did we have to have the bells restored?
The equipment that we had in 2006 was the original equipment, including the bearings, which were straight bearings. And the bearings, especially on the biggest bell, which we call the tenor, the number 8 bell, was getting very worn and was in danger of actually falling out of the frame. So they had to be done. So at the same time, we did other work as well. 6 of the 8 bells had been chipped through a system called Elecom chimes. So the chips were removed, the bells were retuned, and so they are much better sounding, and they're now on ball bearings, so they're much easier to ring. But apart from the ball bearings, it's the same technique, the same mechanics that were on the bells, going back as far as the 1500s.
And it was quite something talking with the head of the bell foundry. I was involved with finding the money to help restore the bells. And he said to us, when we finish this work, you shouldn't have to contact us for another 150 years, which we thought was pretty good. This company has worked with churches such as St. Martin in the Fields and Westminster Abbey literally for centuries.
Yes.
So 2 bell hangers came here from London. Can you tell us what they did and what was involved in all of this process?
Well, they came twice. The first time they came and took the bells out, so they actually removed the trapdoors on 2 levels, plus the floor of the ringing chamber, dropped the bells down. They were sent back to England in a container. They came back about 9 months later, having been retuned, plus they made a new metal frame to replace the original oak frame, which was very badly worn, very badly damaged. And so now they're hanging on the new metal frame. And they actually lowered the whole bell frame down about 3 or 4 feet, so that outside you actually get a better sound, because the sound goes up almost like a chimney effect. So the sound carries better outside.
Now, there are 8 of these bells that we're looking down on. Can you tell us a little bit about them, the tenor, the treble, etc., how heavy they are? It's quite impressive.
Yeah. They're tuned in a regular scale like you'd have on a piano or anything else. Originally, they were tuned to the key of F. Now they're in the tune of key of E. The smallest bell that is always called the treble. The biggest bell is the tenor. The biggest bell weighs about 2/3 of the weight of a small car. So it's a pretty big bell. Worldwide, it's only a medium-sized bell. There are bells that are much, much bigger, and bells that are much smaller. So ours is in the medium range of the size.
And what's that, over 1,500 pounds or so?
It's about 750 kilograms.
Can you tell us a little bit about how these bells are rung, about the art of change ringing itself?
Yeah. The real difference is that to ring in change ringing, which was basically invented in the late 1500s and was designed on a full wheel, so we actually turn the bells upside down. And we always start and finish with the bells upside down. So when we pull the rope, the bell will ring roughly about 1.5 to 2 seconds later. And you have to ring with a precision of 1/16 of a second. So because of that 2-second delay, it's impossible to ring melodies. So we ring what we call changes or sequences, and it's a mathematical way of ringing bells.
And takes years to learn.
It takes a long time to learn. Physically, you've got to ring the bell by yourself and then perfect the timing so you can ring with the group.
And could you describe how a ringing session, how would it take place? So there are 8 of you, each one of you has a rope?
Yes.
Is there someone who calls out?
There's always one person per bell.
Yeah.
So if we only have 6 people turn up, we will ring 6 bells. We pick the 6 bells which sound the most musical. So it could be the front 6 or the back 6, or the skip the 2 and the 4 is quite often done. If we have 8 ringers, we ring all 8 bells.
Now, when the bells had been restored, we had a ceremony here, of course, to rededicate them, and bell ringers came in from as far away as London for this event, and you achieved a peal. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, a peal is what we call a method where you ring the bell, and each person rings the bell roughly every 1.5 to 2 seconds. Every time you ring the bell, the sequence of the 8 bells must be different and must never repeat. So the peal lasted about 3 hours.
Non-stop?
Non-stop, no pauses, no breaks. Everybody rings their bell roughly 5,000, I think it was 5,046 times, never repeating the sequence.
And if you make a mistake, it doesn't count, right?
No, it has to be stopped and you start again, depending on the mistake. If it's an extremely minor mistake, you may carry on. Yeah. And also, just to mention, the method we rang was called plain bob triples. So it was we rang all 8 bells, and it was a method that was first published by a man called Fabian Stedman in 1677.
So this is a tradition which has literally gone on for centuries, and people can ring around the world and go and visit another tower and fit right in.
Yeah, there are basically 6,000 towers in the world.
Which have these English change ringing bells. It's a very English tradition.
Yeah. And most ringers, we welcome in most towers. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions, obviously. Westminster Abbey, you have to be invited. But most towers, you can just turn up on a practice night and you'll be welcome to ring.
I know there's a wonderful tradition here every Memorial Day weekend in the United States. People have been coming here for many years. Can you tell us about that?
It started about 30 years ago when there wasn't even a local band. The ringers would come here and have a meeting here, and they would ring for the whole weekend, Friday afternoon through till Monday noon. And it's carried on. Now we have a local band, so the local band organizes it. And We welcome around about 30, 40 people from all around the world, Australia, England, obviously throughout Canada and the States.
Yes, I can think of people coming from New York City, from Boston, from London and England each year. And the bell ringers here will put up the bell ringers from other countries, and they will do the same for us when bell ringers from here travel to Charleston or to Edinburgh or elsewhere. So it's a wonderful...
It's partly social, but mainly ringing.
Yes, yeah. So quite remarkable. Thank you very much, Douglas.
4-3, 4 lead.
The Cathedral of the Holy Trinity is not only an important historic site, it is also home to a vibrant community. To talk about this community, we're going to now meet the rector and dean of the cathedral, Christian Schreiner. Christian, can you tell me something about the advantages and disadvantages of worshiping in such an exceptional historic environment?
This is an exceptional place. This is very much an inspiring and inspired place. I remember when I first came here, that was 13 years ago, I walked into the cathedral and I was just overwhelmed. And then I did an internship here for 2 years, and when I came back after having spent a few years abroad, and I just came here in 2007 for vacation, and I walked in and right away I had tears in my eyes. So this is a very special place, and it's not just because of proportions. I think there is, as I would say, the Holy Spirit has definitely found a home in the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. So we are extremely privileged when we worship here every Sunday. This is just an exceptional place to worship. It's a place where you can always almost feel and grasp the Holy Spirit at work. So that's a huge advantage to have this building right in the center of the most beautiful city in the world. We have a parking so people can actually come in and stop and come inside the cathedral. Very often tourists who come on Sunday morning, they hear the bells and then they walk right here. So we're easy to find. It's beautiful. The Spirit is right here. And I've heard more than once that this is the place, especially for small ensembles, chamber orchestra. This is the best acoustics you find anywhere in Quebec. So, advantages, that's all the advantages you need. I think we're extremely lucky. We're extremely privileged and fortunate to be here.
And we have challenges, though.
And we have challenges, exactly. So disadvantages, well, this building is over 200 years old. And it's expensive. It's extremely expensive to just keep it the way it is. Our Cathedral Foundation has done a great job over the years. And since we, as the parish of Quebec, we're just a really small community, we have roughly 95 families. It's a huge task. It's a huge task year after year to find the money to help maintain this exceptional site.
Can you talk a little bit more about this small but wonderful community who worships here?
It's a community the likes of which I have never seen anywhere else. But we hear this a lot from people who come here for the first time, tourists who come here in the summer months especially, and who come and worship with us. And they tell us after, like they walked in and right away they felt part of a family. And that's how we very often refer to the cathedral family. And I think something that has been extremely important to us and something that we've been honing over the years is really the welcome. Bishop Gene Robinson, when he was Bishop of New Hampshire, he once said that our first task as a Christian community is infinite respect and radical hospitality. And I loved that, and I preached about that more than once. And I think this is really a motto that we, as the cathedral community, have adopted over the years. Infinite respect, radical hospitality. Whoever walks through these doors is welcome.
And it's also a very diverse community in a French-speaking city. Could you talk a little bit about that, the variety of origins of people who attend services?
On the one hand, you have Anglophones, and there are Anglophones who have been living here for over 200, 250 years. So Anglophone Quebecers. And then you get professionals who just decide, young families, especially among our young families, you have people who made a decision that they wanted to live in a diverse and multilingual environment. So they move here on purpose. And then very often you get mixed families, Anglophone, Francophones who marry, we got married here at the cathedral, even though I'm neither Anglophone nor Francophone.
Originally.
I'm German. But that's not all. We also have a rather big part of our community are Naskapi people. So their hometown is Kawawachika near Shefferville. But many of them in the winter months, they are here in the city when there are no jobs up where they live. So they come to Quebec. They live in Quebec for the winter months. And I've often heard them refer to this as being the Naskapi Cathedral. And then you get tourists. So very often on a Sunday morning when we're at the communion rail and I give out communion, it happens to me that I give out communion in English, French, Naskapi, Spanish, and German. So we've had some refugees who started worshiping with us from Rwanda, from Burundi. I have an assistant priest here, actually, Father Thomas, who is originally from Rwanda and who speaks many languages and who is an important part now of our diocese and of our parish.
And perhaps we could also mention there's a French-speaking community which has a service right before ours also.
It's just, I don't want to kind of draw the line. It's not, we don't have an Anglophone and a Francophone community. There is La Paroisse de Tous les Saints for over 20 years now, and they worship at 9:30 in the morning. In general, in French, however, whenever they have tourists, they adapt and they do things in English, just as we do things in French at 11 o'clock. So yes, there are two parishes worshiping at the cathedral.
And perhaps a last question. Many people love to visit the animals who have lived here. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is now coming to a close in these, I think, next week. For over 6 years, we have been host to Aldo, a donkey, and to Holly, a goat. They've been living next to Bishop Thorpe. That all started because of one of our parishioners. They lived close to Montreal and they had a donkey. And when they moved to Quebec and to a small house, they didn't have a garden, they didn't have any space. So they asked the bishop, could we park the donkey in your garden? And the bishop agreed. And I think this has become very important because all of a sudden you have every day hundreds of people who gather around that donkey. We have a group from Maison Charlotte, women in difficulties who gather once a week to look after the donkey, and that helps them a lot. We kind of, the cathedral close around Aldo has become a meeting place for all the people who live around and who work there, the Ministry of Finance, at the hotels. All of a sudden, they don't just walk through the cathedral close, they actually stop and they start talking. So in a way, Aldo has become extremely important as a community builder. So we're really sad to see him go.
He's now moving to a farm elsewhere.
Yes, exactly.
Along with the goat as well,
yes.
Holly.
Well, it is a goat farm, and I just learned that donkeys actually are extremely effective goat herders. So he will be kind of a shepherd and will have a job.
So he'll have a happy home.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Thank you very much, Christian.
You're welcome.
We ask you now to bless Aldo and Holly. By the power of your love, enable them to live according to your plan. May we always praise you for all your beauty in creation. Blessed are you, Lord our God, in all your creatures. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Christian. Thank you. Thank you.
The Cathedral of the Holy Trinity has been a place of worship for more than 2 centuries. It's filled with history, but it's not a museum. It's filled with life. People come here to pray, to listen to music. It inspires visitors from around the world. If we're to preserve this magnificent building, much effort will be required by members of the congregation and the wider community. Hopefully, it will be here to inspire visitors and worshipers for many generations to come. We finished our visit at the cathedral, and our next visit will be in the Château Frontenac.